Hello everyone, welcome to March 30th, 2018. And what can one do on March 30th, 2018 when it looks like this in Wisconsin? Yeah, 10 inches of wet, heavy, crappy snow and general misery. Well, today's project on my YouTube channel is going to be putting my gearbox back together for the airplane. Took it apart here a week or so ago to change the gear set in it, the gear ratio. That's something I've wanted to do since I put together the zipper big bore kit in it. And well, when I took it apart, I'll show you some pictures of what I discovered. It wasn't real pleasant. There was some damage in there, so I had to replace some parts. And well, you'll see. Well, that's what a messed up prop shaft looks like. This is the internals of that gearbox all laid out, starting with the seal that's on the outside face. There's a spacer and then the main bearing in the front, the 4 bolts that hold that in, another spacer internal, the fuel pump eccentric. I'm showing just one of the shims. This will be a variable. We'll do that stack up here in a little bit. Then there's a ring here that helps hold center on the spring discs. There's 3 spring discs that go in with the clutch, which is this assembly here. I did have that apart before and put it together, cleaned it up and repacked it with anti-seize and put that back together. There's a collar. This piece actually goes in this location on the prop shaft. That will put back on there when we do final assembly, but we'll leave that off for when we do the shim stack up. The driven gear, this is accessory gear, and then a little thrust washer for in there, and then the 2 keepers. And then these, the drive gear, the lock washer, and the bolt that hold it together on the bottom. Up here in this package here yet is the seal that's for the back side of the gearbox on the engine case side. Now that was weeping just a little bit, so I'm going to replace that when I do this. And of course the prop shaft, that there is the new style magnetic plug. And this is the gasket for the mechanical fuel pump. Goes on the side of the gearbox here. And then this is the press tool with my own little shims, and we'll show you in the press here in a little bit how that goes together and how that's used. One of the things I discovered about my particular gearbox, you're looking at the inside of it, I had what they call the narrow gear set, and I am replacing that with what's the wide gear set. And what I'm talking about is the width of this driven gear. I've got in my hands a empty gearbox case for a Rotax 912. And this is going to be the assembly of this gearbox to a fully stacked up, ready to go state. Now, I've had this gearbox assembled already once before, and I had to do that because I am changing the gear set in this gearbox, and I'm going from a narrow 227 gear ratio to the wide 243 ratio, and in order to facilitate that, I had to do some machine work here to the inside of this gearbox to put some relief in there. And in order to do that, I had to have this all stacked up. Well, I wanted to take that all apart, clean all the components one more time, make sure everything was in good shape, and then we're gonna do it on camera here from top to bottom. All right, so what we've got, all the parts out here on the table, and we're gonna start putting it together, and I'll tell you what I'm doing as I'm doing it here. starting from the outside in is how we're going to go on this. This is the outer oil seal. It goes in the very front of the case, and that will go in first, and that seals down behind this lip, loads from the inside here this direction. To put that in, the first thing you want to do is to put a little Loctite 598 is the RTV of choice to use on this, and you want just a little bit on the outside edge of this, not much at all, just a little skim. It does a couple of things. One, it acts like a lubricant to help it go in, and then once it's in there, that will set up and keep any little leaks from happening. Put that down into its bore. What I've used here to put that in place, just a seal driver, and just took my time and worked it around, and it is now about seated all the way down in there. We'll just look at it from this side, and hopefully that shows up on camera, but I'm rotating this around and looking. The seal is seated all the way down to the lip, the front face of the casting, all the way around, and it looks like we're good to go. Next item to go in is going to be the front roller bearing. Now, I've been through the IMRT, the Rotax training, and one of the things that they suggested, this bearing is a new bearing. The one that came out of this case had, I don't know if you can see it, the writing, the labeling was facing the gears. We were told when I took the class to actually reverse this bearing and put the open side to face the gears, and what that's going to do is that's going to allow a little better oiling to get into this bearing in the front here, and prolong the life of the bearing and help keep that lubricated very well with the engine oil that's inside the gear case. Now that the seal is in place, our next item to go in is this spacer, and there's an angled part to the inside diameter here that faces the propeller, the outside, so that actually drops down in there next. And then, as I was showing you before, the bearing with the open face, that will go in up as opposed to this way. I don't know if you can see that, but that the keeper covers most of the balls on that side, but this side it's open. So we're going to put that side facing the splash oiling that we're going to get done here. This bearing is dry right now. What I'm going to use is just a little high pressure grease on here. Very thick, sticky stuff. Again, you don't need much, just because I don't like to assemble things dry. Just spread that around on there nice and evenly. And you don't need much, just a little. Okay, open side up. And just sit that in like so. And just to facilitate this, I'm going to take my gloves off so I can make a mess. And I have set up the proper bearing press tool that fits just the same diameter as the bearing itself. And we're going to walk this over to the press and press it in. Okay, so we're set up in the press here. And this is a nice little press that has a gauge on it for pressure. So as we come down, I can watch that pressure gauge. And we're just pressing that in with a couple 100 pounds of pressure is all that is. It's a pretty light press. And then I can see this when it gets down to its shoulder. which is right there. I'll take the pressure off of it, take the tool out, and you can look down in there and see, I don't know if you can see it on camera here or not, but the bearing is pressed all the way into its seated position and it's flush with the 4 ears going around it. Now we're going to put the 4 bolts and their hardened washers in that retain the bearing. Alright, so next step, we're going to put the bolts in. They're retained Loctite 243, just Loctite blue. Just a little dab will do ya. Just a dot on each one. And yes, I think I need some more coffee today. And the last one, just a dot on there. Snug these down just to finger tight. And I'm just putting just a little more than finger tight on these. The book calls for 130 inch-pounds. I've got Rich's very nice snap-on digital torque wrench. This thing is the bomb. Take it up to about 70. And go full torque. Plus a nice wrench. $130 inch-pounds. And that's what we have at the bottom. Now for most normal regular maintenance of a gearbox, you wouldn't have to pull that bearing or seal out of there. I had some issues that we can delve into later, but I had to strip the gearbox out completely. So next step, we're going to load the actual prop shaft into the bearing and the gearbox, then we can do the stack up on there. Now again, we're going to be going over to the press on this, and I don't like to press together dry items, so we're going to put just a little more of this high pressure grease on that bearing surface. And I don't know if you can see on camera or what in this light, but this is actually tapered ever so slightly here, and then it comes up to a little larger diameter. The finish just changes and you can just feel it with your fingers. It might be 1/1000th of an inch clearance, which, believe it or not, you can feel with your fingers. So I'm just going to put a little dab or 3 of this grease on here and spread it around. Get the excess off my finger. And we can take and we'll just drop the shaft into the opening and just get it lined up on the bearing. and that's as far as it'll sit on the table. So now we'll go over to the press and press that home. It's in the press here, and I lowered the camera position here a little bit, so I hope maybe you can see the distance here that we're going to be pressing this into place. It's got to go probably 3/4 of an inch or so. Again, this is a very light press. Looking at the gauge, we might have a couple 100 pounds on here at most. It's going to come down just a little bit further, and again it's going to hit a shoulder, and this is a really nice press. You can feel it real easy, and we're just about there. That's where it is. Pull the shim off of there, and I can look and see that's where the seal line was, and we should be all set. Let it up a little further. And we're all set. Alright, so we're going to start the actual load of the gearbox. Now we're going to be doing this twice because you have to shim the engagement, because there's springs washers in here, and we'll show you those in a second. But these are the shims, and we're going to be leaving those out for the first load because you have to put it in, compress everything down, and measure how much shim you're going to actually need. So we start with 6mm spacer, goes down right against the bearing. And then this is the eccentric, runs the mechanical fuel pump. That goes in next. Then the next item here, this side goes against the eccentric, and this side you can see there's just a little bit of wear here. This is a, I forget what Rotax calls it, a collar, I believe. What that does is that goes in, and then the spring washers, or Bellevue washer, or whatever term you want to see, is it's a big washer with a dished shape to it. First one goes down, and that, you can see in there, engages that shoulder, so that locates that spring washer. Then the next one goes down, cup down, so they're like this. That one goes on, and then the third one goes cup up, like that, because that engages the back side of the slipper clutch, and this shoulder here goes inside of those spring washers, and we'll locate those. That outer spring washer, you can just maybe see a little bit of where that would touch on here. So that drops in, and you can't get your fingers in there very good, so you have to rotate the case around to reach it from different sides, and there. That just dropped home. That's where we want it to be. So next item that goes in, on the final assembly, you would put this bushing, I guess Rotax calls it. That goes on this surface here, but since we're going to pull this all apart again, I don't want to put that in there yet because that's kind of a son of a gun to get past. So we're going to put the gear in next. This is the driven gear. These are what's termed the drive dogs. Those engage these lumps on the clutch here. So that drops down, and you'll notice there is some play in between these, and that 30 degrees is what you have to measure, and I don't know the number off the top of my head, but when this is loaded and preloaded properly, there's a weight that has to turn on the prop, and that's a given that you have to check on an annual basis. Then there's a thrust washer, a little plastic washer, and then this top gear. Don't know why the camera just stopped on its own there, but I think I was talking about the little thrust washer. Is actually a plastic type material that goes in on top of the gear. And then this final gear, this is actually the accessory drive gear. This goes on top of that thrust washer and engages the spline. And that's the full stack up for this particular gearbox. There's the shims and that collar we talked about before, and then these are the two half rings which hold the whole works together once it's pressed down. So now we're going to go back over to the press. We're going to press this down and we're going to measure how much shim it needs. We've got the gearbox in the press. This is the press fixture, actually for the two-stroke gearboxes. It doesn't quite fit the four-stroke box because that gear is just a little bit too big. So what I've done is I've made a couple of shim pieces that I put underneath this, which will then distribute the pressing force across more surface area of that gear, rather than buying the horrendously, ridiculously expensive piece of bent metal for the Rotax 912 gearbox. We can just reuse this one. So, hopefully I can do this without bumping the camera too much. We're going to press this down. Okay, that's all the way seated. We've got about, well, 1.5 tons of pressure on there, which is what's required to compress those 3 spring washers down. I'm going to try and do this, and hopefully you can see what I'm doing. I have one of the retainer half rings here, and we're going to just put him in place in the groove that it would normally live in. And then to see how much shim we need, we start with, this is a 1 millimeter shim. We'll put that in there. That fits no problem. Rotax makes 3 different shim thicknesses: 1 millimeter, 0.5 millimeters, and 0.2 millimeters. I have here next now, hopefully I can do this without bumping the camera, a 0.2 millimeter shim, and I'm going to try and push that in. And if you look, that just starts in there. It's fairly snug, but it's not deforming or kinking or anything, so I'm not even going to try anything further. This one is going to take a 1 millimeter shim and a 0.2 millimeter shim. So now we can proceed to pull that locking collar back off, and we can let the pressure off of the vise. Maybe you can see how much is in there. See it coming up? Come up just a little bit there, and we'll pull this stuff off, and we'll go and put the shims in and restack. So we're ready to do the final stack up. We know the shim thickness, we know what has to be done. I always like to, just to confirm, for me at least, the best diagram is in, this happens to be the Leading Edge airfoil catalog, and it's, actually I think it's an old one too. Oh no, brand new one, 1718. Just the parts breakout is just the easiest way to see the stack up of what goes where and when going together in here. And if you look at the bottom here, you see there's the seal, that spacer in the front, and then that roller or ball bearing, and then there's an 8 millimeter spacer, and then part number 16 is the shims, and L is the lubricant that they want on all of this stuff going together, which is this weird Kluber Isoflex Topaz $250 an ounce garbage. And everyone that I've spoken to at Leading Edge Airfoils and Lockwood and Hal Stockman, we all use silver anti-seize to put these together. It works much better, or works just as well, and it's a hell of a lot cheaper. So, because it's anti-seize, I'm going to put gloves on again. Anyone who's ever worked with anti-seize knows all you have to do is look at the bottle of anti-seize, and it is everywhere. So we're going to put the gloves on, just silver anti-seize lubricant, and I am going to just dab some on everything as it goes in. This is if you've ever put together an engine, you have assembly lube, and this is basically the same theory. There's our two shims, 1 millimeter and a 0.2 millimeter. That goes in next. They go down onto that spacer. Then the eccentric for the fuel pump. And again, just until things get oiled up inside, we'll put a little pre-lube on it. Don't have to go crazy, and this stuff is totally compatible with the engine oil, doesn't hurt anything. Now the springs, they say they want a decent amount on here, so we're not going to be cheap with this stuff on both sides. Now that is the cup side, the concave side, so that will go up on that one. Seated onto this little collar. The next one, the concave side, will go down, facing the other one. So we'll make sure we've got a decent amount of lube on that one, facing down, and we'll get the back side of this one, where it's going to intercept the next spring washer going in. This one. Concave side, where it's going to engage the slipper clutch. And I actually had the slipper clutch all disassembled and cleaned up and inspected because that was a used slipper clutch that I'm putting in here, and I wanted to make sure everything was good in there. So again, that was the assembly lube for the slipper clutch as well. So now I've got it all over my glove here, so I'm going to use this clean hand to put this down in here. Just go like that with some of that spline. Actually, I'm going to take the brush and I'm going to put some on the spline on the shaft here. Somewhat minimized, but when dealing with anti-seize, it's almost impossible. And the clutch, that face down, that's where that spring disc engages to. Down all the way. Sure feels like all of the spring discs are lined up. So I think it is. Now, the drive dogs are another spot where it needs lubrication, and that's where we want to be pretty liberal with this stuff on these ramps of these drive dogs. Both on the clutch side, and it seems a little weird putting grease into a clutch, but like a motorcycle part that's a wet clutch, it's designed to work in lubrication. See how I've got it on the drive ramps on here. Apparently the GoPro likes to shut off every so often. So now, before that gear can go on, this collar needs to go on. And again, as long as I've got some anti-seize on my fingers, we're just going to smear some around on there. Again, you don't have to have tons on everything, but just as an assembly lube. So that goes on and gets started, and see how that spreads out? And you can just start it with your hand. You might have to get a screwdriver to finish this. There. Okay. And that pops down into position there. Those can be kind of a son of a gun to get back off, which is why we only put that on there when we're doing the absolute final assembly here. Okay, so next part here, make sure there's some slippery smeared around in there. So that can go in. That's engaged nicely. You'll notice with that little bit of lubricant on there, that now fits together a little more snug. And then the final piece. Okay, just a little assembly lubricant on there. And there's our full stack up. No parts left over, so that's a good thing. So I'm going to take off my dirty gloves and we're going to go back to the press it home, and put the retainer clips in. Alright, so we're back in the press here, and we're going to just carefully start pushing that down. It might make some popping noises if those spring discs need to seat a little bit. Okay, and that's down tight. We're showing about 1.5 tons of pressure, and I can see it from my vantage point. I don't know if you can see on the camera. Let me see if I can. I'll just take the camera right off the tripod here and go right in here close. See where the notch in the shaft is? There's a spline below, kind of in that pocket, and a spline above, and there's that groove. That groove is where the keepers are going to ride. And if you look, hopefully you can see, the bottom face of that groove is about flush with the top face of that ring around that accessory drive gear. And that's perfect. That's where you want to be. So, sorry for shaking the camera here. Back in a tripod. I'm going to put the retaining clips. This is always just a little bit scary to put your fingers in here. Retaining clips are in, and then we gently let the pressure off, and there it is. Gearbox is fully loaded, clipped in place, and ready to go back on the airplane. Alright, so we're out of the press, and you can see the two, maybe you can see, I hope you can see, the two half-ring retainers in the little pocket of the accessory drive gear, holding the shaft and the springs compressed, and we should be ready to roll. I have one more step that I need to do. My propeller that I use utilizes these shims, or these bushings, sorry, and they go in the propeller flange, but I'm not going to be doing that right now. That'll happen later. As I'm assembling this onto the airplane, we'll put those in. But I also have to replace the bearing and seal on the back side of the gearbox. The bearing and seal that engage this surface here as part of the engine case, not part of the gearbox case. I'm still waiting on the bearing. I don't have that one yet, so through the magic of editing, it'll look like we're going right there from here, but it'll probably be a week. Alright, thanks much. See you guys later. Hello everyone. Larry here again. I'm just going to pan around here just a little bit. We are looking at the front of the engine with gearbox removed. And now, put my camera in the right spot where you can see what we're going to do. I'm going to insert into this bore here the seal and then the rear bearing that goes on for the gearbox here. Supports the back side of that shaft like we just saw in the other video. And hopefully we can get this put together here today, and then it's just hurry up and wait for my prop, which will hopefully not take too long. So let's get on it and put this together. Okay, looks like that's bottomed out in the bore all the way in. We'll clean up our little bit of RTV that's on there and put the bearing in. So the seal is in place. Here's our bearing with a little bit of anti-seize around the outside edge. And we are going to just tap him home now too. Okay, so the bearing is in place. Looks like it's seated all the way around. And we should be all set there. Okay, so I'm going to put the snap ring in here hopefully with my snap ring pliers, which is not the right size, but it worked. It's in there. Okay, so here's a little close-up of what we just accomplished. Put that bearing inside, the snap ring on, the seal went in first. Now normally if you're just doing a maintenance on the gearbox, you wouldn't have to worry about that. This was a little more involved situation here, so but that's in there. The end of the crankshaft here with the drive gear on it. And this half is all assembled now. So we're outside here now. I'm going to put a little RTV. This is the same RTV that we've been using everywhere, if I don't lose it off my finger. The RTV 598. Okay. Bring that back over, grab my towel out of here, clean off my fingers. Okay, so we got the gearbox housing back on, and I am just now going to torque the bolts in place. We're just doing the regular crisscross type pattern. And I was just looking up the torque value, and I just twisted my wrench here. And the two bigger bolts on the bottom are 133 inch-pounds. And the rest of them are about 120 inch-pounds, I believe. I'm going to double check that. Just checking to make sure they're all torqued.